So as we talk about the Psalms, one of the big things I wanted to just talk about is just this way of thinking about it. So if you look at this graphic, maybe you've read things like this before, maybe you haven't, where Psalms are divided into different genres, right? So here, the main genres we have praise, lament, trust. There's royal psalms. There's another, some other stuff. The one that's cut off is wisdom psalms, thanksgiving psalms. So we have different genres of psalms that are listed, and this is really helpful, right? Because especially if you look at praise psalms and lament psalms, they share a lot of things in common. But the thing that's really unusual about this is that this way of thinking about the book of Psalms is really, at least when we look at the history of the church, really new, right? So really the first person to really talk about this is, and we're going to go back to some of your reading from the first week. If you did your intro reading about kind of Old Testament theology and how people thought about Old Testament theology, you remember that it kind of started really late, like up until 1700s, 1800s. People really thought about studying the Bible in terms of theology, what we would call systematic theology now. They would call doctrine or something like that. But they didn't really think about it, sometimes biblical studies, the way we do now. And when it first started, it was really almost more of a secular way of thinking of things. They wanted to think about these studies in the Bible and the Old Testament in a way that they felt was more scientific. And so if you remember from your reading, it talked a little bit about like structural analysis. It's called form criticism and redaction criticism and some of these things. And actually what really came out of this, and one of the big things that did this was there was a scholar named Gunkel. There's always the German scholars, right, that do this stuff. He noticed because of what we call form criticism, which I think you did a little reading about, but we haven't talked about a whole lot in the class because I don't think it's necessarily super helpful. It really just tries to identify what is going on in different passages. So for example, in Psalms, it's a little bit more easy to do this, but throughout the Old Testament, you'll get things that aren't in wisdom literature, for example, that we would define as wisdom, right? Wisdom sections in other books, or prophetic sections in narrative, or sometimes people will say something like there's an oath narrative, where like in the middle of a narrative, there's a certain pattern that's followed, and they all share these similarities. So that's form criticism. And this scholar, Gunkel, he started noticing and reading Psalms that there was a lot of them that were really similar. And so he started to group these Psalms by things that he thought were similar. And then he had a guy that will talk, a student that will talk, this was at like the earlier part of the 1900s that Gunkel was writing. And he had a student named Mowinckel who kind of added to it. And then there's another guy, Klaus Westermann, who does a lot of commentating as well, a German commentator, that he added even more to it. But the thing that's interesting about all of this, I think, is that Westermann, when he's writing and he divides praise psalms into like descriptive praise and declarative praise, like something that you'll see in a lot of textbooks now. The book that he wrote about this was written in like 1987, right? And this is the first time this stuff is really being talked about. And so we're talking most of these genre studies and thinking about the Psalms in this way is maybe only 100 years old, which, that's a long time ago. But to me, it's also surprising, right? That in all the history of the church, people weren't really thinking about the Psalms this way and trying to identify them and consider them this way. So anyway, as we think about these Psalms, we actually would put the imprecatory Psalms in with what we would call the lament Psalms here. And so one of the big ones, and we'll deal with it a little bit tonight, is Psalm 109. And there's a lot of things we'll have to deal with. There's some other ones as well, but we'll actually look at some of those things. But I just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of even thinking about Psalms in this way. Like the fact that before people would just read and be like, oh, this is a Psalm, it was by David, and all these things. And there are some thought as well, like if we sort this differently and we do it where it says by book instead, then you're gonna shuffle these all around because Psalms is divided into different books, book one, book two, three, book four, book five. And there's a lot of thoughts actually, and there's been a lot of work on why are they divided into these books? Is there a purpose? Is there a story being told? And a major commentary, he argues that they're grouped this way to kind of tell the history of Israel in each book, and it kind of follows the story of Israel. And we don't have a lot of time to get into that. You can do some more reading on it if you want to, but there's a lot of actual talk about the book of Psalms as a whole, not just like the individual Psalms. And so I just wanted to expose you to that just a little bit before we jump into these to get you thinking about that. So what we want to do now, I actually do want to start, excuse me, going into the imprecatory Psalms. And so when we think about the imprecatory Psalms, we're talking about these are the ones that people identify: 35, 55, 59, 69, 79, 109, lots of nines, and 137, right? So these are the main ones that you're going to see. And they are not currently up on Moodle right now, but I will put these lecture slides up on Moodle for you to download as a PDF later. So if you want to focus on listening instead of writing notes, I am totally good with either way, but don't feel like you have to write what's on the slides. If you have other notes to write, that is great, and I'm very flattered that you feel that it's worthy to take notes. But don't feel like you have to write what's on the slides because I will make them available to you. So before we get into these Psalms even, I actually want to just read some of them so we can get an idea of what it is we're dealing with here. So let's go back to this one. And we want to look at, sorry. Let's look at 35. Maybe. Oh, having some trouble getting here. My keyboard broke earlier today. Psalm 35. Hopefully you can I can make this a little bigger for you. There we go. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler and rise for my help. Draw spear and javelin against my pursuers. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Let them be put to shame and dishonor who seek after my life. Let them be turned back and disappointed who devise evil against me. Let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. Let their way be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. For without cause they hid their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my life. Let destruction come upon him when he does not know it, and let the net that he hid ensnare him. Let him fall into it to his destruction. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord, exulting in his salvation. All my bones shall say, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and needy from him who robs him. So we're going to stop there just for a second because this gives you an idea kind of what these Psalms are saying, what they're doing. We see a little bit of the psalmist's struggle here where he's asking God to rise up against his enemies. So far, I think we're okay, right? But I do want to jump over to Psalm 109 because we're going to see that this is where maybe we're going to have some more difficulty. Oops. So if we look at Psalm 109, it says, do not be silent, O God of my praise, for the wicked and deceitful mouths are open against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. They encircle me with words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, but I give myself to prayer. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. Okay, so we want to we'll skip a little bit, but it says, may his days be few, and may another take his office. May his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg, seeking food from afar, from the ruins they inhabit. May the creditor seize all that he has. May the strangers plunder the fruits of his toil. Let there be none to extend kindness to him, nor any to pity his fatherless children. May his posterity be cut off. May his name be blotted out in the second generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord, and let not the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be before the Lord continually, so that he may cut off the memory of them from this earth. So this is where I think we would say things are a little bit more intense, right? So when he's asking, what he's actually asking for in the famous passages that we hear, like I think in 137, that the last one that's listed here, I think is where it says, may you dash their infants upon the rocks. That's the famous one, right? And that's where we really have difficulty. And so when we talk about the problem with imprecatory psalms, I think the big issue that we have, like, where does the name come, first of all? If you just look up in the dictionary, an imprecation is a curse. And so the problem that we have, and the question we have to answer is, how, as Christians, if we're looking at this in the Old Testament, we struggle with this because we have to ask the question, how is this loving our enemies? If we're supposed to love our enemies, what is going on with these psalms? And there have been so many explanations for how we should think about this, ways to consider. And so I want to just talk through all of the options that have been given, so you can get an idea of how people are thinking about these. You'll like some more than others. I guarantee that you'll like some solutions more than others. And then we'll talk a little bit about what I think is maybe a way through for us. And then what I always want to do, and I think will be helpful to us, is talk about how when we read imprecatory psalms, first of all, we need to be able to understand them rightly, but also they are in the Word of God. We need to be able to apply them. How can we apply these if we're dashing infants upon the rocks and all of these things, like asking for people's children to be cut off and cursed, all these things? How do we fit this into what we would call like a Christian ethic, right? How do we fit this in with the New Testament? Is it saying something different than the New Testament says? And I don't think it really is, but we've got to find a way reading this now as Christians to fit this in. And so we'll hopefully end up there. So possible solutions to the problem of imprecatory psalms. The first one is just the nature of poetry. So poetry uses hyperbole or exaggeration. Hyperbole is like the literary term for it. So really what they're saying here is that poetry itself tends to exaggerate. And so sometimes people would point to the Song of the Sea in the book of Exodus, where you get the narrative where the Israelites walk through and on dry land as the sea is parted, and then the Egyptians go through and the sea falls in on them. Well, the first chapter that tells the story, it tells it in a narrative form. And it just gives us the details. They walked through and it was like on dry land. But then right after that is the Song of the Sea, which is sung by Moses and Miriam. And in that, it's a song, right? It's poetry, and it says, "For you hurled the Egyptians into the sea." And if we're reading, we're like, oh, did God actually hurl them? Did he throw them into the sea? It's using poetic language, right? Now, we know, because we are smart people, that that's okay, right? We don't need to be fraught with, it's dramatizing what happened, and that's totally fine, because we understand that the Bible is literature, and sometimes it speaks that way in a lot of places, and that's okay. We're fine with that. So poetry does use hyperbole. Is that what's going on here? They would actually say, people who propose this view, that these curses are only figurative. The psalmist is emotional and is exaggerating, doesn't want to actually to have these things happen. My response to that is that this is still problematic, right? Even if there is some degree of exaggeration in a hyperbole, we still have problems, right? The things that are said are still pretty extreme. And so although I think our maybe solution to how to think about imprecatory psalms has to include this, just because as we're responsible readers of God's word, recognizing that this is poetry and it works a little bit differently than like a biography we would read or a science textbook or something like that. It does work a little bit differently. I think we still have a problem here. And so this doesn't totally get us out of the issue, right? So this next one is much easier for you to reject. So just know you won't have to struggle with it quite so much. But I mentioned before that there was a guy, Gunkel, that came up kind of with this way of thinking about the Psalms and dividing them by genre. And he had a student named Mowinkle. And Mowinkle took this view called effective magic. And basically, he was just saying that when this happens in the Old Testament, he and many of these German theologians, they view the Old Testament, not as the Word of God. They view it, they're trying to reconstruct like the original Israelite religion. And that's where you get some of these weird things that, we've addressed a little bit in like trying to reconstruct the Pentateuch from different parts, like the documentary hypothesis, things like that. Well, what he said was like, this is just like any ancient Near Eastern religion. And what they're actually doing here is they're not just expressing a wish or asking God for something. They're basically using magic words. These curses, they believe that when they say these things, they are causing these things to happen to the other people, right? So, as I said, this one's a little bit easier for us to deal with because, the Old Testament just outright condemns that, and like dealing with that kind of magic and messing around with those things. And so I think Mowinkle had some issues, obviously, but he was trying to find something to hold on to rationalize what he saw as almost like a pagan Israelite religion. And so to escape some of those difficulties, he came up with this effective magic theory. Okay, next one. And there's kind of a lot of these, just so you know. Inferior ethic. This believes that between the Old Testament and the New Testament, ethics actually change. And so this is like if you guys have taken systematic theology or maybe like historical theology or history of the church, and you read about Marcion, right? Do you guys know Marcion? Do you remember him from anything? He's an early church guy, and he hated the Old Testament. Like, he just really hated the Old Testament, and he felt like the God of the Old Testament was a different God than the God of the New Testament. And so he just kind of took all the stuff he didn't like out, right? And so this is really along the same line of thinking. It's basically saying the things that are taught in the Old Testament are not the same things that are taught in the New Testament. And that the ethics of the Old Testament we can understand today are actually inferior. And so when these things are happening, for them it was okay. But we now know as Christians that that's not okay. And so they would see Jesus' teaching as a new revelation. Now, there we can agree, right? Like Jesus' teaching is new revelation. And I'm going to use some technical terms here, right? When we talk theologically about what happens in the New Testament, we call that progressive progressive revelation. And that's different than, for example, Muslims in the Islamic religion. They believe in something, I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, called abrogation. So in the Quran, a new revelation totally just covers up the old one. So if there's a conflict, it's okay, you just believe the newer one, right? And that's their general way with dealing with some of these issues. And it's understood, so that's called abrogation. But we don't believe that. We believe that the New Testament does not contradict the Old Testament. And so though we can agree that Jesus' teaching is a new revelation, it doesn't change anything. It gives us more information. Does that make sense? You tracking? Nod your head? Okay, yeah. Some people are nodding their heads. The people I can see. So we agree that Jesus offers, I see a thumbs up. Thank you for that. We agree that it's new revelation, but we don't believe that there's a different ethic between the Old Testament and New Testament. So we can't just look at this and say, the only reason that the psalmists prayed these things is that they just didn't know Jesus. And so the Old Testament religion and what they believed was just not as good. That's going to be seriously problematic. As a pastor, as a reader of the Bible, as a Christian, it really ends up messing with your whole view of the Bible. Because even Old Testament theology, biblical theology as a whole, one of the main touchstones, cornerstones in it is that the whole Bible is one unified story, right? And so if we start to throw ideas around like this, we have some problems. Anyway, if we look at things like Exodus 23, 4 through 5, and some other ones, we also see that this is not true. You can go to that one later, but basically we would say it's a very loving ethic that is presented there, where basically people are encouraged to really consider what they're doing. We see it all over in other places too, some random places, like in Deuteronomy, like 12 through 26. A lot of Bibles, if you check the subheading, it will say like various laws or something like that. And for like all 14 chapters, it's just like what we would consider to be very random laws. But in there, there's some really, really interesting ones, important ones, like about how when Israelites build their houses, you have to be sure on the roof to put basically a rail so that people don't fall off the edge of your house for safety. Or when they go and invade a land, they're not supposed to cut down all of the trees. Things that seem kind of random to us, but are really acts of kindness. And then in even things we're more familiar with, like from the book of Ruth, the idea where they're supposed to leave the corners of the field for the poor to glean from. Something that, at least I'm American, you're not going to find that in America today. We think it's crazy. Or even what some people would consider to be almost communist, the year of Jubilee. All debts are cleared. If you sold your land to someone else, you get it back, right? Things that we really would not even consider in the modern world to even do are built into the societal structure of the Israelite nation, of Israel. And so it's just things like that I want you to consider even when you're thinking about this, because sometimes we'll go to things like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And sometimes people get upset about that. But really, it's meant to demonstrate that there was a limit. Like if someone pokes out your eye, you're not allowed to chop off his arm, right? Like it's actually meant to restrain, not to give you the chance for violence. And anyway, the point is that the Old Testament does demonstrate a loving ethic, I think. Now, the next one, prediction over pronouncement. This says that what is actually happening in these Psalms is not actually asking for judgment, but predicting the future. The psalmists are basically saying, these people continue on this way, they continue acting this way, then this is what will happen to them. And I call it almost a Proverbs-like thinking. So if you read Proverbs, I teach Wisdom Lit. It's one of the courses I teach for ABTS, and I love teaching Wisdom Lit. In Proverbs, when we talk about that, we say Proverbs is wisdom for when the world works the way it's supposed to work, right? So if everything's fine and good and the world is working the way God designed it, if you do good, you will most likely receive good. If you are hardworking, you will probably be successful. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to that, and that's Ecclesiastes and Job, right? And we know this. But in general, that's what will happen. And so people who say prediction over pronouncement are basically saying that this is almost like a Proverbs-like thinking. And we will come back to that because I think it is part of our solution too. But this goes like fully there where it says that they're not actually asking for these things to happen. The psalmist is actually just saying, if they continue this way, these are the things that will happen to these people who are wicked. As I said, I do believe that there's a small part of this, but if you're reading the text, you don't get indications. If you read it, what I would say the natural way, like if you're just sitting down and reading this, you're not going to think to yourself, it really sounds like this guy's predicting that their life will go bad, right? You're reading it and it really sounds very strongly like they're asking God to do these things. So just keep a mental bookmark in your head to come back to that, because I think there's a part of this that's a part of our solution, but you can't really go fully this way. I don't think the text supports that. Next, messianic. This one's a really interesting one. Christians love this one, right? Because these Psalms are fulfilled in Jesus. Here's the deal. Some of these Psalms are quoted in the New Testament, and they are quoted of Jesus, things that happened to Jesus. And that's where we don't have time in this short period together to go over how the New Testament uses the Old Testament and lots of different issues having to do with that. It's an Old Testament class anyway, although it is an interesting question. Some people would say that ultimately Jesus takes all of this wrath, all this maybe what we would call hate that the psalmist is hurling at their enemies. Ultimately, Jesus takes all of that punishment, the weight of all of that sin and that hatred upon himself. Now, there is a sense theologically in which that is true. But I don't think it really necessarily helps us to understand these psalms, right? Theologically, there's a way in which this is true. There are some of these quoted in the New Testament, but they are not all quoted by any means. How they're quoted is very selective and is not actually like the intent of these psalms. The way they're used in the New Testament is for kind of a different purpose. And so I don't think it gets us out of it. Although theologically, I do understand why people would think of things this way. Because there is a theological understanding that can help you out a little bit. Human vindictiveness. This is another one that's really great because it's easy for us to understand is not true, right? So they just say that these psalms are not inspired. All it is human emotion. And so obviously, you know, if we have a high view of the Bible, we believe in biblical inspiration, we can just kind of discount this one. But basically it just says that these are human emotions. They have nothing to do with God. They're not really God's words, so don't worry about it, right? So that one's easy. We don't need to worry about that one too much, but it is a solution that has been proposed. We have a little bit of a weirder one, representative of human injustice. So basically, these are recorded for the benefit of all those who experience injustice. And so they are in the Old Testament, they're in the book of Psalms, because even today, we experience injustice. We experience these same feelings. And so even though maybe they're not the best emotional state, maybe it's not things we should do and think, they're recorded for our benefit because we know that God hates injustice and we can identify with these. I can agree with that. You know, I think, why are they in the Old Testament? I can buy into that a little bit, but it doesn't solve our ethical problems still, right? We still have the same problem. Like, these are still strong emotions that as Christians, we have a hard time dealing with, understanding how they can be expressed in what we think of as a Christian way. So it doesn't solve our ethical problems, although again, just like the messianic way of thinking about it, I think we can buy into this at least a little bit and understand where it's coming from. The words of others. This is one of my favorite ones, depending on how you think of the word favorite. But it basically says, and we don't have time to go into the Psalms to really do this, I think. I don't think it would be super helpful to you. But what it's saying basically is that in translation, like Hebrew, biblical Hebrew does not have quotation marks, right? So like if someone's quoting something that someone else is saying, it's not always clear. And there's some passages in the Old Testament where like there are problematic passages where if you understand them as a quote, it really does help you to deal with the issue. So some people would say, particularly in Psalm 109, that what is actually happening when these very extreme things are being said is that it's not actually the writer of the psalm that's saying it. He's quoting what the enemies have said to him, right? And some of it can be supported in the Hebrew, most of it can't, right? So it's a good suggestion, and like doing some good exegetical work in the text can get you there a little bit. But if you really work hard and you're working with the original languages and looking at the text and understanding it, the grammar of the Hebrew in most of these Psalms just cannot fully support that they're actually using other people's words. So good solution, but unfortunately it doesn't hold true for all of it. So it doesn't really totally solve our problem. But it is, I think, an important thing for you to understand because some of the Psalms, there are issues that maybe in English or whatever language you might be reading it in, it's maybe not as clear as it is in the Hebrew who is actually talking. So I wanted to present that one as well. National, not personal. The curses target nations, not people. Some of these, I think it's 79. It does really actually talk this way, where it's talking about the nations, is asking for God to curse the nations. And, if you've been following along, you go to Genesis chapter 12. I will bless those that bless you. I will curse those that curse you. There is something to this, but there's always a but, right, in all of these things. But not all these Psalms really talk that way. There's actually only a very few parts of a few of these Psalms that really couldn't be taken this way, to be talking about a nation and not an individual. So in some cases, it's true, mostly not. And so it lacks support. And as we've said a million times, it still has ethical problems. Like, even if you're asking for God to curse and cut off the descendants of a nation, it's not really all that different than asking God to do that about an individual, right? And so it doesn't really solve our main ethical problem that we have anyway, right? And then this one's going to sound familiar probably to a lot of you in our Christian way of thinking. A distinction between the sin and the sinner. So the anger in these Psalms is targeted at the sin that they did, the things that they've done to him, not the sinner. I would say that the language here is really hard to separate, like when he's asking for the person not to have any children, and the children he does have to be fatherless and hungry and in poverty. I think that's maybe a little hard to really say that he's dealing just with the sin and not the sinner. Although, again, as we've seen in probably, I think, like 4 of these now, I think maybe part of this will help us lead to a solution, and we'll get there in just a minute. And I think it's a difficult balance. Even now, I am not a huge fan of love the sinner, hate the sin. It's the way of thinking. I think it's much more difficult than that statement, right? Just as we as people, like, to totally separate someone from what they do, I'm not even sure that's totally biblical, right? Because of the book of Proverbs and lots of other things too. But we are not in New Testament class, so we don't have to talk about it, right? Just kidding. We'll get to it in just a minute. But it is a difficult balance. It's a very difficult balance, and I don't think it gets us out of our trouble. But it's an important thought to consider, that there is some aspect of this in here, that they are sinful, and there's some of these feelings are justified because of these sinful actions. Okay, so I think that's it for all of our proposals. So I just want to go big picture here and think key elements of imprecatory psalms. So some of these, right? So when we think about genres of psalms, like, some of them are really quite easy. Like lament psalms, though it might shift around the order of where some of the elements are in these psalms, most lament psalms have like certain sections that are there, like a request for mercy, a cry for innocence, and like an expression of trust. Like, they might shift around for different reasons where it is, but they have kind of a set thing. There's another kind of psalm called, a lot of times they're called kingship psalms, and it's a clump, like from like Psalm 95 up into 100. There's a whole section of them. Now, I don't really actually like that phrase. I prefer enthronement psalms because they talk about God being on his throne. And it's not saying that we are making him king. It's saying that he is king already. And so I just kind of prefer that term. But that's one where the thing that they have in common isn't like a structure, but what it has in common is they all use the phrase Yahweh Melech, like the Lord is king. It's somewhere in there. And there are some other things too, but it's not a structural thing as much as it is the kind of content that's in it. And I would say that imprecatory psalms are similar, right? We don't have like a set structure to an imprecatory psalm, which I wish we did, because the Psalms tool that I was using in Logos, it very nicely will split out the different sections of Psalms for you and show you how they fit together, and it's very nice. But unfortunately for imprecatory Psalms, we don't have an order that's very clear. But what I would say they all have in common, in some way or another, is unjust persecution, like bringing the care and thought to God for unjust persecution, a request for God's action, and faith in God's justice. Those are big, big, big categories, right? Um, but I think it's important that they stay big because these Psalms cover a lot of different territory. They have similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. But I think all of them have these things. I want to bring up just another quick thought for you, because one of the most asked questions in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, if you look at questions that are asked, is how long, right? All over the book of Psalms. How long, O Lord, before you, da, 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 da. Habakkuk, another one. It starts with, how long, O Lord? Well, I think that sometimes we can think of that question as, challenging to God, like offering a challenge to God. But I really think that it's important to understand, and especially for these imprecatory Psalms, that it's a question of faith, right? They're not asking, will you do, or are you going to do something, God? But they're saying, when will you do something? And there's a big difference between those things. So asking how long is a question of faith. You believe that God will do something. You just don't know when, right? And you're asking for action, believing the action to him, right? And so that's why there's unjust persecution, there's a request for action, but faith in God's justice. Those second two go really, really quite closely together, right? They're asking for justice, but they believe that God will bring justice sometime. Okay, so I would argue here that understanding, if we're going to find a way through this, understanding vocabulary and how the Old Testament uses it is vitally, vitally important. So what I say here, you remember, if we go back all the way to the first slide, I said the main problem is most people phrase it is that imprecation equals curse. And so if an imprecation is a curse, then this is not like a Christian ethic. I would say that not that any of these Psalms uses the word imprecation, it's just a word we use of these Psalms. So I think we need to think about what these Psalms are doing a little bit differently, because if we just see these as curses, I think we have a problem. But what I think is actually going on, if you read these Psalms carefully, is that an imprecation is not a curse. The psalmists here are not asking for God to curse these people, right? It's different. So when we read in the Old Testament an oath, I mentioned this earlier in kind of the different forms that sometimes the text will take. An oath is something that is addressed to yourself. You say to yourself, if I do not do this, may God do this and this and this. And you'll see this formulation a lot in the Old Testament in various different places, right? So we have an oath, and then we have a curse, which is addressed to another person. Like, this is going to happen to you, right? And then what I think is an imprecation. And what that is that this is addressed to God. Give me just a second. I need to... I'm having some problems recording the class. It popped up with something. And this is, I think, a really, really important distinction. So an oath is addressed to someone else, or to oneself. A curse is addressed to another person, but an imprecation, as we see these Psalms, is addressed to God. Why is that important? I think this is a huge, huge difference. And just the word that we use and how we understand these Psalms really broadly before we even start reading them can get us into a bad place, right? So if we understand that these are addressed to God, I think this is the beginning of a way to a solution, right? Because he's not saying to, David's not saying to Saul, may you be cut off and your children be in poverty and all these things. What's happening is the psalmists are going to God and saying, this is what I want to happen in your justice, right? But that's a big difference, because ultimately, all of these Psalms trust God's justice. And they are bringing this to God, and they are not acting. Does that make sense? Okay, because I think this is going to help us get someplace. So principles to remember. And these are, I think, the principles that will help us find a way through to understand these Psalms and apply them. So I know it's a little bit small. Hopefully you're not like on a phone or something. It's going to be really tiny, but you can check the slides later. First principle to remember, when the psalmists are asking for God's judgment, that judgment is not damnation, okay? And I'm going to the New Testament for this, for several of these, but I think that it's helpful in understanding. So 1 Corinthians, you have the situation where church discipline is needed. There's a man who's sleeping with his stepmother, and it's a bad situation. And so what Paul actually says to them is that I want you to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Basically, he's saying you need to do church discipline. You need to cast him out of fellowship, because in doing so, even though that is a painful thing, it is a kind of judgment. Ultimately, his soul will be saved. And actually, reading 2 Corinthians, like that's what happened. Basically, we get from reading 2 Corinthians that he's repented, but people are still kind of shunning him, and they don't really know how to deal with the issue. But we see that it was probably effective, right? But the important principle that we get from this thinking, and I think is important to bring into imprecatory psalms, is that request for judgment is not a request for damnation. Like, they want to see these people judged for their actions, but that doesn't mean they want them to go to hell, to use like New Testament language or Christian language. I would also say Proverbs frames the judgment. So judgment, not damnation. They do want judgment. That doesn't mean they want them damned for all of eternity. Proverbs frames that judgment. And this is what I mean. I told you we'd come back to this idea. Psalm 109:16, one of the more difficult imprecatory psalms, because the language is so strong. It says, why does the psalmist want this to happen? It says, for he did not remember to show kindness, but pursued the poor and needy and the brokenhearted and put them to death. Well, this is language that's almost directly from Proverbs. And there's actually, I couldn't fit it on the slide because it was already tiny already, but there's actually many more verses in Psalm 109 that sound like they basically come from the book of Proverbs, right? Like when it says, what did he do? Well, he did, yes, offend me personally. He did things against me, but it lists other things too that really fall in line when we talk about the righteous and the wicked, the wise and the fool in the book of Proverbs. It falls in line with that, and it uses the same language that Proverbs does. And well, what does Proverbs say about those people? What does it say will happen to them? Well, as I said before, like generally speaking, Proverbs is wisdom for when the world works the way it's supposed to work. And if you are lazy, you'll probably not have an easy life because you'll end up in poverty. If you are hardworking, you probably will have a successful life. And there are exceptions to that, of course, but generally speaking. And so I said, I think this is a part of the solution, that when they are asking for these things to happen, I think there is at least a chunk of this explanation that says, well, I want their kids to be in poverty and I want them to die. There's a sense in which this is what Proverbs says will happen to these people. If they continue in this behavior, if they continue to sow violence, they will reap violence. And if they continue to sow violence, most likely their children will be cut off too. And so I do think that there is actually a relatively big part of this is understanding that Proverbs does play into this. Basically, if he's asking God for justice, Proverbs is framing this justice. And the things that the psalmist is asking for are for God to do what he already said he would do, right? If we understand Proverbs this way. Like God says, this is what's going to happen to the wicked. This is what's going to happen to the violent, to the lazy. And really what the psalmist is doing, at least partially, is saying, God, you've already said this is going to happen to them. I want it to happen because I'm really struggling because of what these people are doing. And I think we also see this play out, and you can't just throw it onto like a general other. Like this played out in the nation of Israel. Right? God told them what would happen. They continued in their ways. And it happened. And so a lot of times the prophets, which we haven't covered prophets yet, the prophets are asking and calling people to turn back to the way they're supposed to. But sometimes the prophets are just saying, look, God, you said this was going to happen, so just do it. Right? And really, Habakkuk, which I already mentioned once, is one of my favorite books. Ecclesiastes is my favorite, which if you have done this week's lecture, you already know that. But it is my doctoral studies are on Ecclesiastes. I love that book. Probably my second favorite is Habakkuk, though. And the main outline of Habakkuk, he comes and he's living in a time in Israel, like if you follow the timeline of the prophets, he grew up during one of the good kings, right? Like when he was young, it was a good king, the nation was prosperous. But when he is currently living is a bad king. And he basically is standing, from what we can understand, he's a watchman on the wall. He's standing out looking over the nation and saying, God, how long before you bring justice? The nation is wicked. How long before you bring justice? That how long question, right? And God actually answers him, which is probably surprising to him. But God says, I am going to bring justice on the nation, and I'm going to do it using the Babylonians. And then Habakkuk's like, oh, no, no, you can't use them. They're even worse. They're more wicked. And he says, oh, well, I'm going to judge them too, right? So, but the important thing about this is that he's doing the same thing. You could, in a way, say that Habakkuk is almost praying an imprecatory prayer about the nation of Israel. He's looking around and saying, God, you said that you would judge this nation if we did this. How long before you do that? And I would argue that imprecatory psalms are doing, in a lot of cases, a similar thing, saying, God, you said you would judge these wicked people. How long before you do it? Right? So that's part of it. And then throwing a little bit extra in there. Vengeance is God. All of these things go together. Judgment is not damnation. Proverbs frames the judgment. Like this is something God already said would happen. And then ultimately, vengeance is God. So we go to Romans, which it's quoting the Old Testament here too. It says, Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. So I'm actually going to argue here, and maybe in the question and answer time, you can come at me a little bit about this. But I think that actually what is going on here is in the imprecatory Psalms is very much what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 12. That basically these people are dealing with some strong emotions because they are experiencing injustice, but they are not avenging themselves, but bringing it to God, asking for God's vengeance that he has already promised on wicked people. Now they're asking for it more specifically on the people that are their enemies, but I think that all of these things are framed within the other parts of the Old Testament that we've read. So if you just pick up your Bible, you never read it before, you open up to an imprecatory psalm, you're probably going to be super concerned about the Bible, right? But if, as we should, we read the imprecatory psalms in light of the whole Old Testament and the New Testament, I don't think that we have a problem. I really think that we can see what is happening here is that they're experiencing and expressing true emotion in these psalms, but they're not doing it themselves. They're not going out and killing this person, but they're asking for God's judgment, which he's already promised to come upon the wicked, and saying, how long before this happens, God? Because some of the imprecatory psalms include that question, how long, right? And they're saying, and a lot of them include explicit statements of trust that God will act in some time, but they just don't know when. And so I think ultimately they're leaving this vengeance to God. And so even though the language is, we think, problematic, to use a modern term, problematic, I think that what is actually happening in how they are bringing these feelings is okay. It's actually basically what Paul is saying in Romans 12. They're not avenging, but they're leaving this vengeance to God. And they're bringing that feeling and that request specifically to God. I would argue, I don't know if you've done the Job thing yet for this week. When we cover Job in Wisdom Lit, I say a similar thing. I think that Job ultimately does sin and accuses God. But he is ultimately, I think, also commended for his honesty to God. That he brings, like the accusation of God, obviously not good, but he's very honest with his feelings to God. and God is not afraid of that. Habakkuk does the same thing. The questions he asks, I think, are very, when I read the book, very modern questions. Concerns about injustice and what God's going to do and when he's going to do it, and asking all these almost like postmodern questions of God. And that's part of the reason I really like that book, because I feel like I can identify with it a lot. And I think that's why there is a place for imprecatory Psalms here. Because let's be honest, probably most of us at some point in our life have been really, really mad at someone about something. Maybe we didn't want their children to be cut off and be put into poverty, but we all have had someone who did that thing to us in our lives that we were super, super mad about, right? So let's get to application. If this is how we can understand these Psalms, what does it mean for us? I would say that if we take all these things into account and we think about these Psalms, I would say that these Psalms are for when you cannot let go of your anger. Should we as Christians forgive? Yes, we should. We know that, right? But I think that there's also room for us when we can't let go of our anger to speak honestly to God and leave justice to him. And that allows us to make room for love in our actions. I think this is what Paul is teaching in Romans chapter 12, right? When he says, let God avenge, like don't avenge yourself, vengeance is God, he will repay. Then he immediately follows it up with loving actions, right? Because what this allows us to do is maybe, politically, like I said, I'm from the US. The elections in the US the past couple years haven't been great. I'm sure you guys know. Like, the US is very, very divided politically. And there are people that really hate people with opposing political viewpoints. And as a Christian, maybe they can't even let go of that. They really just feel anger toward someone with a different political viewpoint. I mean, I'm on Facebook. I see it all the time. That's why I'm not on Facebook very often, right? Like political posts. But what I think this does is allows us, just like the psalmist did, to bring that anger to God and say, look, this person really harmed me. They really injured me. They have been like a thorn in my side, or this group of people is so terrible and I'm just so angry all the time. You can give that to God and say, look, I believe that what they are doing is wicked. I don't believe they're good people, and I can't do it. But God, I trust and I know that you ultimately will judge the wicked and the righteous, and I can leave that to you, and that frees me up to be loving to that person. I would argue, although we haven't gone there exegetically and specifically, that we see this in the life of David with Saul. Saul's pursuing him. David has the chance to kill Saul, and he doesn't do it, right? Why? Because Saul is God's anointed, and he doesn't believe that he should do that. Although I really strongly think he probably wanted to do it, right? He can leave that vengeance to God, and ultimately Saul does receive his judgment from God. And so we see that story play out, this whole principle play out in the story of David and Saul. But I think it's really instructive to us to know that, so many of Psalms of lament are written by David when he's being pursued by Saul or by enemies and all of these things. But bringing those concerns and that anger to God frees him to make righteous choices. Make sense? Okay. So, 804, questions or concerns. This is where we open it up. I know I have not said everything perfectly. I probably said some things that were confusing. So this is where I open it up to you all. If you have any questions, thoughts, struggles, whatever it is.